who always had the sick note to get out of PE. I was that young boy who was the last to be picked for any team. Oh, do we have to have Fogel? But move forward a couple of years, and I was looking for something that would surprise my critics and really, really take me out of my comfort zone. One evening I went online and I started researching some of the toughest races on Earth. And I soon discovered that not only had people rowed across the Atlantic Ocean, 3,000 miles of ocean, but there was a race. People would compete against one another. And I was captivated. And there and then I signed up, including a very hefty deposit on my credit card. I was committed. And it was only after signing up for this 3,000 mile endurance race across the Atlantic Ocean that I thought about the small print. Those small little details, like the fact I'd never rowed before in my life, didn't have a rowing boat, didn't have a rowing partner, and I didn't know very much about the oceans. How hard could a race like this be? This was 2 years before the start date, and for the next year I buried my head and pretended nothing was happening. But a year out, things were getting pretty serious. I needed a rowing partner. And one evening I found myself at a party in central London, a little bit drunk, and there across the room I spotted James Cracknell. I recognised him because he'd just won his second gold medal in the Olympic Games in rowing, and my first thought was, there's a bloke who knows how to row. So I bounded up to him enthusiastically and I said, hello James, you probably don't know who I am, but how would you like to row across the Atlantic with me? And he looked down at me. I'm not that short, by the way, I'm 6 foot, but he's a very tall rower. He looked down at me and said, have you ever rowed before? And I went, no, never rowed before in my life. And he told me to get lost. Apologies, by the way, for the isolation hair. We've been in lockdown for 4 weeks now. I digress. He told me to get lost, but I persevered. I suppose a great metaphor for where we are in lockdown ourselves. Perseverance, don't give up. Let's not get this far and abandon it all suddenly. I got his details, and a few weeks later he agreed to meet up. Now, James and I couldn't be more different if you tried. James is the professional Olympian. Olympians are unique amongst us. Can you imagine the sacrifices and the dedication that you have to make to become an Olympian? Imagine the sacrifices to your social life, the sacrifices to life overall. For many of them, they dedicate their entire lives towards one discipline. In James's case, it's rowing, arms back and forth, back and forth. Can you imagine 360 days a year? They have just a couple of days off. Can you imagine the focus, the drive, the determination it takes to become an Olympian, the best in the world at what you do, and all to win a piece of metal? Bearing in mind that often that metal is not real gold, not real silver. It's all this notion about being the best at what you do. The sacrifices are extraordinary. And James, even amongst Olympians, has a fearsome reputation for pushing himself and those around him farther and harder than anyone else. This is the man. Many of you will recall that this time last year, aged 47, competed in the Oxford-Cambridge boat race for the Cambridge squad and helped them come to victory, helped them win. He was twice the age of his fellow rowers, and even older than some of his fellow rowers' own dads. I mean, he has extraordinary drive and focus. And then there's me. Some of you may be new to my work, but I'm pretty enthusiastic. I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. I hate competition. I'm not particularly good at any one discipline. I'm fiercely stubborn and determined, but for me, variety has always been the spice of life. We couldn't have been more different if you tried. So we teamed up. We became, as the press described us, the odd couple. And over the next year, we had to become ocean yacht masters. We had to do sea survival courses. We had to build the boat. It came flat packed like an IKEA chest of drawers. And I can't even do that. I need help in our own home when we get IKEA furniture. We had to learn first aid. If we needed stitching, if we broke a bone, then we would have to fix it ourselves, put stitches in, fix the bones, set the bones, replace fillings. Once we were out on that ocean, we would be on our own. For a year, we had to pass tests, we had to do sea survival, and the morning of the race, we turned up at the start line, us and 30 other boats from all across the world. We had got ourselves just ready for the requirements needed to start that race. The one thing that I had never really done or failed to do was to actually learn to row properly. In fact, the sole training in the lead up to the race had been on a rowing machine while I filmed in Africa, in various countries, Namibia, South Africa and Botswana. And the morning of the race was the first time our boat had been in the water, the first time James and I had been in a boat together. Our preparation had been far from perfect. I want to give you a little anecdote that sums up that lack of preparation. Can you imagine the emotional farewells we'd had to our loved ones? We knew we were going to be at sea for many, many weeks in a long, dangerous race. Lots of tears. There was quite a lot of press interest in the odd couple. As we got into the boat enthusiastically, first of all, I realised I'd forgotten my rowing shoes, ended up rowing the Atlantic in my Converse trainers. But as I put the oars in, I felt a tap on my shoulder from James. "Mate," he said, "you've put the oars in the wrong way round." First stroke of the oars, I fell off my seat. We couldn't have been less prepared if we tried. We decided that we would do a routine of 6 hours together. For the first 6 hours of the race, we'd row together, and then we'd break into a routine of 2 hours on, 2 hours off. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for as many weeks and months as it would take us to row across that ocean. One of us would always be on those oars, no matter the weather, no matter our ill health, no matter our hunger, our dehydration, tiredness, fatigue. Nothing would stop us. One of us had to be on those oars. There would be days when the wind was just strong enough that despite rowing for 24 hours, we would remain static in the water. There were other days that when the wind was so strong that it would blow us into negative distance, but we would be slaves to those oars. We'd never tried this, but this was going to be how we would approach the race. Just imagine the scene then. After those first 6 hours, I came off the oars and James took the first shift. I remember looking at my hands. They were covered with blisters, bleeding. My back was aching. I was dehydrated. I was hungry. I was homesick. I have never wanted to be somewhere less in my entire life. And most significantly, I was petrified, terrified, because I realised I was stuck on this boat with a complete nutter, a madman. You see, in all the preparation we'd done, it had purely been academic. We'd never just got to know one another. We'd never gone to the pub to have a drink and talk about our hopes or aspirations. We'd never even discussed our goals. And it transpired very soon after we began that we had very different goals. James was very much in this race to compete, where I was there to complete. I didn't care if it took us a year, 2 years to row across that ocean, as long as we did so in the spirit of the race, in one piece, and we arrived on the other side of the Atlantic alive. James didn't care if we died halfway across, as long as we put in 100% effort. I digress. Imagine now, 6 hours in, I already don't want to be on this boat. I clambered into the little cabin space that we nicknamed the coffin, and there was our sat-nav, our timetable, effectively. And it had distance to destination, 2,996 miles. We'd done 4 miles in the first 6 hours. And it gets worse, by the way. Underneath it had speed, half a mile an hour. And that was my Everest moment, this insurmountable mountain, challenge, task, road ahead. I couldn't see any way through this. In some ways, we can bring this back to lockdown for all of us in the world. We've been in lockdown for 4 weeks. When this began, it felt impossible. How on earth were we even going to maintain 4 weeks of this? We now have the prospect of many more, but we've begun to break it down. We've begun to familiarize ourselves with the whole notion of living a new routine, a new lifestyle. And the same happens on that boat. But there I was in that little cabin space. I have never wanted to be somewhere less in my entire life. How did we get through? Why did we not give up? I think it was a shared stubbornness. I think the fear of failure kept us rowing. Believe me, everyone had seen our lack of preparations and were convinced that we were not going to carry on. Everyone was convinced we were going to turn around, and we were not prepared to give in to our critics. We weren't prepared to cave in. For that next week, we disappeared into a depression. It's very easy to fall into a dark cloud, into a metaphorical hole. It's one of the reasons why I keep trying to share as much positive content, trying to lift spirits as much as I possibly can, because those dark clouds are never far away when you're feeling overwhelmed with the magnitude of everything all around. For a week or so, James and I did dip into a bit of a depression, if I'm to be honest. We barely chatted, but a week into it and we had finally started to get used to life at sea. We got used to this routine, and that's when complacency settled in. This is something we're all at risk of happening now. We've been in lockdown for 4 weeks. What can go wrong? People are going to start becoming more liberal with the rules and regulations. Well, on that boat, that's exactly what happened. We stopped wearing life jackets, we stopped wearing safety harnesses, we stopped stowing things. We'd been at sea for 6 weeks now. We were doing very well in the race. We felt like we had nailed this thing. We were the masters of this ocean rowing malarkey. And that's when the ocean came to bite us on our bottoms. It came to remind us that it was in charge. I was on the oars very early one morning, and I saw something I'd never seen before: white water. All around us, waves were breaking. James was in the cabin. The sun was just about to break on the horizon, and I saw white water breaking behind the boat. The next thing I knew was a falling sensation. I felt a rush of cold water as I slammed against the Atlantic Ocean. The oars were ripped from my hands, my feet ripped from the boat, and I tumbled like I was in a washing machine. We'd been capsized, pitch-poled to be specific, the most violent form of capsize, in the middle of the ocean. We were 2,000 miles from the start line and 1,000 miles from the finish line. We hadn't seen another ship or vessel for weeks and weeks. We were entirely on our own. I tumbled through the water, and eventually my head broke the surface and I could see how mountainous the waves were. There, 100 meters away, was our upturned boat, no sign of James. That was the first time in my life I was convinced I was off to meet him up there. I was off to meet my maker. How on earth were we supposed to get out of this one? I didn't have a life jacket. I didn't have a safety harness. How was I going to get back to the boat? Somehow, I made it to the side of that vessel. I grabbed on the side, I hauled it around and was able to right it. I clambered aboard. James was alive. He was in the cabin. He'd been battered and bruised, but we were both alive. We'd lost almost everything. We'd lost the water desalinator that converts salt water into fresh water. That was our safety line, really. We'd lost our stove to heat the water. We'd lost our sea anchor to stop us being blown backwards. We'd lost all communications, our satellite phones, our VHF radio, our navigational aid. Everything was gone. I was ready to pull the EPIRB, the emergency beacon, to summon rescue. Of course, rescue isn't easy in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No helicopters and planes can reach you. The only form of rescue is shipping has to be diverted. But I couldn't see how we could possibly go on. James had other ideas. He looked at me. I was in deep shock. He threw a wet towel at me and told me I had 5 minutes to pull myself together, get back on those oars before we lost a position in the race. Can you imagine? We'd just nearly died and James was still obsessing about this race. But do you know what? To this day, it remains one of the best decisions I've ever agreed to go with. James was quite right. Had we pulled that EPIRB, rescue would have and could have taken up to 2 weeks. And what's more, we had the bare basics to carry on. We had packed emergency water in the ballast of the boat. The weight that holds it into the water was made up of cartons of fresh drinking water for such an emergency. We had paper charts hidden in waterproof bags in the boat and a little handheld GPS to put the plot longitude and latitude. So we had the absolute basics. The oars hadn't broken on impact. And what was extraordinary was that in that instant, 2 strangers became friends for life. James is godfather to my children. I'm godfather to his. We remain firm friends to this date. But it was also a tipping point in the whole journey. We became more efficient. And for the first time, despite the deprivations, it almost became fun for the very first time. But the deprivations were pretty big now. From drinking 20 litres a day each of water pre-capsize, we were now rationed to just 2, maybe 3 litres a day. From eating 10,000 calories, that's what we were using to row across the Atlantic Ocean, we were now consuming just 2,000 calories a day. We were starving, we were hungry, but we were making incredible headway. The thing about rowing the Atlantic is that there are fleeting moments of such beauty that it almost makes you want to cry. When I think back to it, that entire crossing was not a happy one, if I'm to be honest. It was hard, it was tough, it broke me, if I'm to be honest. But there were moments of such beautiful illumination that I will never forget. There was one day we were rowing along, middle of the night, and the boat ran aground. We were in the middle of the ocean. I couldn't begin to fathom what had happened. And it soon transpired that a whale had come up underneath us and physically lifted us out of the water. That whale stayed with us for several days. I could see its silhouette surfing in the waves behind the boat. It's something I will never, ever forget. The sunrises, the sunsets, every single day. And what was extraordinary on that ocean was that there was great solitude and isolation. We were together, James and I, but because of the routine, because of the rota, the shift system of 2 hours on, 2 hours off, most of that row across the Atlantic Ocean was in isolation. We had fleeting moments of hello to one another when we barely grunted to communicate. But essentially, we really were on our own. And it gave me a huge amount of time to think about life, to think about what I had done, what I had achieved, what I wanted to achieve, where I was going. There are so few times in our life when we almost get to press the pause button. How many of us have said that over the years? I wish I could just get off the merry-go-round for a second and just breathe and luxuriate and think and analyze and remember. Now, as much as none of us want to be in the predicament we're in now, this is the moment to reflect. This is the moment to build. This is the moment to dream. This is the moment to change, to be bold, to take risks. If ever there was a moment when we could press that pause button, this is it now. And rowing across the Atlantic for me was one of those moments. 49 days after setting off from the start line, which was on the island of La Gomera in Spain, James and I crossed the finish line in Antigua. We were the first two-man boat, but actually we were penalised because we had gone into our fresh drinking water, the emergency drinking water, and we were penalised, so we didn't come first technically in the race. But that didn't really bother me because we had done it. We had done what we set out to do. I will never forget that feeling of arriving at that finish line. I was convinced everyone thought we were dead. We had lost all communications for those final 10 days, and I had no idea whether we were going to arrive to be told that people had attended our funerals, or whether we would arrive and there would be our loved ones on the finish line. Well, the latter was the case. I'll never forget seeing my mother, my then girlfriend Marina, who I had decided while rowing across the Atlantic Ocean that I would propose to her, and we would become husband and wife. It remains one of the most special, magical, life-changing moments of my entire life. Rowing the Atlantic wasn't easy. I wouldn't do it again, but it taught me so many lessons about resilience, about fortitude, and about believing in yourself. Every single day, something threatened that row. Something would break. Something would happen that would jeopardize the row. It almost happened hourly. It was almost unbearable at times, but we believed. We worked as a team, we collaborated, and somehow we crossed those 3,000 miles together. It really was a tipping point in my whole life. It was the first time I really realized just what was achievable if you really put your mind to it. If you really, really want something enough and you believe in yourself, you can achieve extraordinary things.